Hello and welcome. My name is Cecile Green. I've been a social entrepreneur for 25 years and today I'm here with Round Sky Solutions, which I helped to found. We train mission-driven leaders who are interested in having effective collaborative organizations. And today I'm here to explore an idea with you, a new way of seeing or understanding our work communication. And when I say a lens or a new way of seeing, it's much like glasses that you might put on that help you to see the world a little differently. Perhaps recognize some patterns there that were always there, but perhaps you didn't see. In particular, I've been passionately interested for all of my adult life in this question of how do we work together in ways that are more effective, more productive, more collaborative, more fun, and more generative. And I'm curious if you've ever had any of these experiences, perhaps an organization that's not bringing in enough revenue to sustain itself, or teams that are caught up in being siloed and fighting for turf rather than in the well-being of the whole organization. Chaotic operations perhaps, or a bad apple rotting the whole bunch. And maybe ineffective, efficient, unproductive, or irregular meetings, staff overwhelmed by workloads. I certainly have, and in my time working in mission-driven organizations, I found myself continuously confronted by these frustrations, and it was only after one particularly stunning experience where I was working in an organization that had been started by some very good people, very well-intentioned, very well developed, and great vision for where they were headed, and yet the operating conditions inside the organization were so toxic that people were leaving faster than we could get them back on board. Some of them, their health impacted by the experience of working in this organization. The operations were so chaotic that we experienced expensive mistakes repeatedly. And this differential between the high quality of the people in the organizations, the incredibly good intentions behind the organization, and yet the terrible conditions for working sat me back on my heels. I couldn't believe it. And frankly, it revealed to me that I had an assumption. I had an assumption that if you put good people together with good intentions, you will get good organization at the end of the day. Reality had a different story to play, in that happens sometimes, but unpredictably. And this really prompted my quest in the last 5 years into what is this missing part of the equation. I know that good organization is possible. I also know that good people and good intentions aren't quite enough. There's something else that's needed. And I began my quest with a hypothesis that every act of work we do requires that we communicate. In other words, we must exchange information to get a single act of work done. And in the course of my digging in to the research and all of the theory that's been developed in the last several decades around organizational development, individual growth, integral theory, and beyond, a simple experiential truth emerged that essentially communication forms this crosshair. It is the central place in which all organization depends in order to act effectively and productively. And as I studied communication, I discovered a very basic, useful lens, and that is process and content. In other words, we're speaking of lenses here. So every act of communication contains both process and content. And what I mean by that is process is the how we go about communicating. Content is the what that we end up communicating about, the details. And as I dug into this, I realized that most organizations hyper-focus on content. They treat content as vastly more important than process. In fact, sometimes process is even relegated to the trash bin, being called a waste of time. I've heard that happen. But the truth is these are two sides of one coin. The coin of communication requires both a process for how we communicate and a content. An example would be, in this moment, I am using video to communicate some new ideas about work communication to you. So the process is the video, the content is these ideas about work communication. And this is true of every moment. So as I dug deeper through my research and synthesis, I identified 7 different kinds of work conversations that we're having already. So just briefly, these 7 conversations are purpose, business model, strategy, governance, operations, interpersonal, and individual. And to briefly introduce them to you, purpose is where are we headed? Why are we here? I found it's best constructed of vision, mission, and values, so a trine. And vision is, what's the possibility that we would like to make happen here as an organization? What's the difference we really want to make in the world? Mission is, what's the work that we uniquely would like to do as an organization? And values are the principles within which we agree to abide as we go about our work together. So those 3 together form our purpose, our organizational purpose. And an example of purpose would be if I walked into a meeting, I might ask, why are we having this meeting? It's very simple. And if you've ever been in a meeting where the purpose wasn't clear, you'll readily understand just how frustrating and how inefficient things can be. The second conversation, business model, actually does something very simple, and it explains how any organization exchanges value with its environment. So what good is it delivering, and what value does it receive back in return for the privilege of delivering that value? Now, an example of a business model conversation might be our revenue is trending down over the last few months. What shall we do about it? And that's our business model. Strategy is different than business model. It's commonly confused with business model, but it's different. Strategy is how are we going to get from where we are today towards where we would like to go, towards that beautiful vision of our purpose and the possibility that our business model spells out in all the nuts and bolts. And an example of a strategy conversation that might be happening is I walk into a meeting and say, I have way too much on my plate. I can't get it all done. What shall I focus on? So strategy is always about priorities. What are the key priorities that I need to be aware of right now? Governance, the 4th conversation, is really about all of the shared agreements we have about the pattern level of who does what with what authority in the organization. So shared agreements, patterns around authority. And an example would be, let's see, I walk into a meeting and my computer is broken. I might ask, is there an IT person around here? Hopefully I get a positive answer because I need some help. And that IT person, that is a pattern level. That IT person has certain accountabilities in their work, and one of those hopefully is fixing my computer. Now the 5th conversation is operations. Operations is all about the daily details, the specific projects, the specific next actions that we undertake in order to get our work done. And back to that example of my computer being broken, I might approach my IT person and say, hey, I have a presentation in 2 days. Can you help me get it fixed in that time? That's an operational conversation. The 6th conversation is the interpersonal, and this is really all of our relationships between those of us who work in an organization. I think of it as a field of relatedness, much like the air that we breathe, that's constantly present, and it's either nourishing us or it's toxifying us, and anywhere on the spectrum in between those. An example might be a colleague and I are constantly butting heads because we have very different styles at work and we really don't get each other, and kind of constantly tripping up on those differences. And the 7th conversation, the individual conversation, is really about me and you with all of our gifts, all of our liabilities. And an example of an individual conversation might be, I walk into a meeting and I realize this is the 5th time I've walked in and I'm unprepared. I have not done what I said I would do. This might prompt me to really look at building my organizational skills, strengthening an edge that will enable me to deliver better and serve the organization and work with my colleagues more effectively. So those are the 7 different conversations that are happening already in an organization. And the interesting thing is that they're often happening unconsciously, so kind of behind our eyeballs, not perhaps terribly effectively either, or perhaps they're happening, but they happened like strategy often happened like 10 years ago. But we need strategy on a daily basis. Can't get by without it, and so we make it up if we don't have it. Now, the other thing is that often these conversations are merged with each other. As I mentioned, business model and strategy are often conflated or confused with each other. And the trouble with that is that each of these different conversations has a different process and content need. That's how I knew that they were different from each other. In other words, the content or the output of my business model conversation is a model, much like a blueprint or a chart, or, a drawing of a house, of what it is that we would like to be. Right? So it's an intended blueprint. And the process for getting to that intended blueprint is very different than the conversation that we might have about strategy. The output of strategy are specific targeted initiatives that are going to help move us forward from where we are today towards that intended vision. And the process for coming up with those initiatives is vastly different than the process that we use to come up with our business model. And so when you have the two confused or conflated, you end up with a muddy output, a muddy end result of your conversation. One other thing that emerges from seeing these lenses is that often troubles show up in one or another of these particular conversations, commonly, frankly, in the interpersonal, but its roots aren't there. Its roots are perhaps in governance. Our shared agreements aren't clear. We have different assumptions about who should do what in the organization, or perhaps our strategic priorities are misaligned, and I think we should be going this way, and someone else thinks we should be going that way. So the interpersonal is a place where these issues arise, they show up, but if we try to fix them there, often we get partial, if any, results from that. It's much like if you or I went to a doctor and we had an illness, something that wasn't healthy, and the doctor chose just to treat the symptoms rather than look at the underlying causes. We might experience partial, if any, relief from our health dilemma. So these 7 conversations, what I found so exciting about seeing them is that we can construct simple integrated practices for our conversations that deliver effective outputs. And these practices can be easily learned and transmitted organization-wide. The key thing there is that if we only have one team doing their communication work really effectively, but not the rest of the organization, we still end up with a partial relief from our difficulties. So what do I mean by integrative? Integrative is a really interesting word, and based on the last 5 years of deep dive into the academic and experiential work out there in this field of effective organizations, I stumbled across multiple different incredible bodies of work that have been done. Everything from appreciative inquiry to results-based accountability to holacracy and sociocracy to getting things done and Carver governance, and the list goes on and on and on. And I was stunned by the amount of fantastic work out there. And once these 7 conversations gelled, I was able to see where each of these different methodologies can apply their best value to one simple set of practices that can be learned and applied organization-wide. So to give you a specific example of what I mean, there's a principle from ecology that I found incredibly helpful. And that's this principle that in all healthy ecosystems, there is no waste. It's all reconsumed by someone, somewhere in the ecosystem. And the corollary to our human organizational ecosystems is that as a species, we've evolved this incredible capacity to notice what's wrong, what's missing, and what's broken. I call this tension sensing. So the capacity to sense tensions is an evolutionary given. It's a biological imperative. Brain science has showed us that we notice negative input 10 times faster than positive input. And problem is, in most organizations, there's not a very good equal sign. There's nothing there to reliably consume all of that tension sensing and to produce productive solutions at the end of the day. So that is an example of one of the principles that's integrated in at the heart of all of these practices is our capacity to sense tension, but then to rapidly convert it into something productive that serves the organization and the individuals in it. Now, what I discovered really from all of this work is that the missing piece of the equation is good process. Good process that gets us good content outputs for our communication. We have to communicate in order to get our work done. And frankly, in most organizations, the way of flowing that communication is simply not well seen. So to give you a more concrete sense of how this lens makes a difference in daily organization, I was recently training a local food manufacturing, specialty food manufacturing organization, and the owner was really struggling to keep up with all of the demands on her energy, and she was frankly ready to throw in the towel. And upon beginning to use this lens, the organization realized that they had very little clarity about who was accountable for what in the organization, and therefore many of the unanswered questions simply fell back on the owner's lap to deal with. And once the patterns for who had authority to do what were clarified, the owner was able to go and take a couple months long-deserved rest in order to rejuvenate herself and return to the organization in a much more resourced state to continue. So sometimes people ask me, you know, we're all good people, we all have good intentions, but, you know, why can't we just work it out? Why can't we just work together effectively? And the piece that makes the most sense to me is that we've simply been stumbling around in the dark with what it means to communicate effectively, because we can't or haven't been able to see each of these conversations as unique, needing a unique process with unique outputs. And so with this new lens, we can really begin to leverage much more effective ways of working together. And we're really excited to convey this, to share this new lens with you, hoping that it will make, as you apply it in your organizations, you able to get more traction with yourself and with your teams. We'd really like you to be able to make good use of it. So we've put together a bunch of tools, and you'll see the links to those below this video. It includes a printable version of the 7 conversation cards and further references and a set of practices. I'd also really love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and your questions in the comment field below, and we'll be responding to those personally. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you.